when I got to the outback, I thought, at different times of the day, there's every colour you ever want out here. I mean, it's just saturated at sometimes and enormously subtle at other times. And doesn't matter what colour you turn up with, it's there somewhere.
Is that right? Yeah. I mean, most people probably wouldn't see it. Do you have to look for that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you'll look because you're an artist. That's what you're looking for. I mean, I'm a colorist. Colour is the first thing I see. I mean, that's my bias. There's no doubt about that. I mean, but where I've been going, Glennis and I have been going recently out to Ross River, out to the East McDonald's, which is magnificent country. Some of the colour late in the afternoon that hits those rocks, which look reddish but become luminous in a way that you just could not describe. I mean, in the Kimberleys, I mean, I've been around a lot. I took American students to Kakadu. I've been down the coast in boats. I mean, sometimes the colour is shocking, absolutely shocking.
What time of the day do you think that most?
Oh, for me, it's late afternoon. Recently, Glennis and I just had a week on our own out of Alice, and the sun went down, and it was a pretty nice sunset. Not fabulous, but really very subtle and very beautiful. But then, as the sun disappeared, this reflected light hit the hill behind us, and I mean, that's what I'm trying to work out now. How do I make a colour of that luminosity? And it's just extraordinary. Yeah. And, and the watercolour in Kakadu, the clarity of it in some cases, and the shadows of being black. I mean, the Indigenous guys have seen it all. They pick it up. I mean, and it's extraordinary. And, I go to Fowler's Gap, this place that the university has run and owned for years, the other side of Broken Hill, to Mutawinji, which is Barkindji country, and my mate Badger Bates, who's a Barkindji elder, we got to become friends, and he taught me how to look at the stars and how to think about Indigenous thinking and spirituality, and we just become mates.
And do you find that your connection with the Indigenous artists has changed your work?
Oh, crucial. I mean, if the work when I'm dead means anything, it means that I've been able to, and probably in the last few years, bring together two disparate aesthetics or something. One is Indigenous, but it's not so much trying to paint like Indigenous guys. It's how they see the land. What are they seeing? How do they see it? I mean, it sounds very pretentious, but it's kind of the philosophy of looking and thinking.
Well, I suppose one of the things that you already had in common was the fact that you don't paint representationally.
No, that's right.
And that your work sits somewhere between the representational and the abstract.
It does.
And, of course, the Aboriginal artists are just brilliant in that way, to be able to see in a totally different way than the figurative way.
Yep, that's right.
So you must have felt this sort of connection already.
Sure, but what I had the problem was that I was taught in a conventional, if you like, Renaissance kind of manner. Not that was bad, but you learn to work like a European. That kind of thinking, when you come up against the Impressionists, then Cubism, particularly Cubism probably, you realise that, hey, look, this way of seeing the world that we've been taught and it has been practiced for, quite a few hundred years, is just one way of seeing the world. The world is not as clear-cut as that. And, photographs don't talk about smell and taste and, and artists have tried to do that. How do you, Picasso, when he was giving a bit of a hard time when he'd moved to slightly more abstract paintings, said, well, you don't ask a bird what song it's singing.
Yeah.
You don't say, is that the concerto by, Or is that the latest rock and roll tune? No, you respond to the beauty, the call, something happens between you and the bird, which is pretty special. If you're open to that. If you're not, it doesn't happen.
And that's why I think partly why it's almost impossible to talk about art in a way. Well, what we're trying to do right now is not that effective.
Of course it is. I mean, and it's one of the problems about writing about it too. I mean, that's why probably poetry comes closer to drawing or painting. I mean, there's some peculiar things that happen with painting, being static, and a whole range of things which, music has a beginning and end, all sorts of things. And, that the more you read, great writers, they understand that, they talk about it, and so you've got to respond to it. So, I mean, when I first came back and started painting in the landscape, I set up and I paint that thing in front of me. Now I just go out and say, I'm here. Oh, yeah, that looks all right. I'll use that and I'll use that. And other times, like these pictures I'm working on now, Glenn went for a long walk. I sat for 3 or 4 hours in one of these ponds, basically on my own for all that time, just looking at the water that's in this pond area, which is funny, it's an English term, isn't it? But a pond area with big, wonderful shadows, enormously luminous rocks with the late sun hitting it, the odd bit of tree or grass, occasionally something else you'd see move. It's just exquisite. I mean, you're trying to make sense of all that, and pictures, if they're any good, can. I mean, but it's a struggle, and sometimes you're lucky.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that, because obviously you have painted water and ponds and things like that hundreds of times.
Yep.
But you sitting down and observing as if afresh.
Yeah.
Again.
Oh, sure. Because it is, there's a book called The Unquiet Landscape by a guy called Neve. It's basically English landscape. But, I mean, he's right, and so is Susan Sontag. I mean, the day is never the same. No day is the same. Every day is different. One of the poets said, how did we not know that every day is a god? Something happens. The water is never the same. It's always the same and always different. I mean,
So that must feel the same when you're actually starting a new painting each time.
Absolutely.
So you're never feeling as though, I'm just sort of, going through the motions again, or...
Well, if I do, then I paint over it, because that's really bad. But, when you're a younger painter, I painted a few pictures which I thought were pretty good because it looked a bit Matisse-ian, right? And that was fair enough, because I was trying to work out where he's coming from. But when I started to paint more directly in the landscape, I mean, this landscape in the outback here has nothing to do with a European view of the world at all. So you had to kind of, how do I deal with this?
Yeah, right.
When you're painting and you're trying to do something with sort of, I don't know, maybe too intellectually or something, right? When you're trying too hard, I mean, I'm sure athletes, it's a creative experience we're trying to talk about, I guess. When you do that, often it looks a bit stilted, right, or a bit too contrived or cliched. I mean, that's the great problem with writers. They write something, they read it and they think, shit, I've read this 10 times before by other people. Psst, next. So, but when you actually paint something out, if you say, this area is crap, I'm just going to get some white paint painted out. Okay, when you do that, you're not thinking in the normal way you're thinking, because you're just letting it flow. And sometimes that's just painting it out. But sometimes what you left is so much better because you painted out that lot. Okay? So it's a kind of way you do things. You must take the risk when it's not working. I mean, Frank Arbach is what did he say about that recently? I read in one of his catalogues. He used the word stonking picture. He said, to make a really, I think he said great, but he used the term, which is, I think, an English slang term, stonking, a really stonking picture. He said, what you've got to be able to do that is to paint over a really good painting.
That's very scary.
That's what it's about.
But would you do that?
Absolutely.
But
I've done it so many times.
But why would you no, there must be something about it that's not working.
Sure. But, the biggest problem is you've painted a picture, or in my case, there's one in there that's got 5 pictures underneath it. Okay, you've painted a picture and it's looking pretty cool, pretty good. Yeah, things are going well. It does feel a bit about the place. Everything's looking good. And you're putting stuff on it and taking stuff away and you're looking at it, and that might go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And you think, yeah, I really like that picture. I mean, I can show you on that one. I really like that picture. Something, it looks a bit, I don't like that bit at the end, and the more I look at it, it's starting to be a bit, no, I can't live with that. And so I think, okay, no one will know, only me. That's the problem. So I know that left-hand side bit doesn't work. And if I change it, the whole thing could fall down. And sometimes it does, so you have to start again.
So it might be just a small part of the work that is just going to just wreck the whole thing.
Absolutely. For you. The total thing has to work in every level, right? Every level. And the trouble is, the more you get practice at finding those things at fault, the more you see them and the more problematic it becomes. So Giorgio Morandi, when he was late in his 80s, who is probably one of my great heroes as an Italian painter of landscapes, particularly his landscapes. Most people know him as still lifes, which are brilliant. But
I didn't know he did landscapes.
The landscapes are to die for. They're tiny and they're wonderful. He said, how is it that I've painted all my life and it never gets any easier? And that's right. It doesn't. How can it be? Because you've honed this skill, intuitive thinking, looking. Every great picture is in your head and saying, yeah, not that right-hand corner, that's a crappy bit of painting, or that colour's wrong, it doesn't do anything for that other colour. All those things, they come back to haunt you, and that's who you're playing with.
Yeah. Well, composition must be a big thing about that.
Absolutely.
As well.
I mean, that again, Matisse taught me about composition. And you can see what he painted over. You can see what he was thinking when you look closely. I mean, I always go and look at an angle on the pictures because if they're highly glossed, you can see what he's painted over or whatever. You can see where he's done another move or whatever. But yeah, and sometimes you just, I mean, particularly the small works, I now have got to the stage, if it really isn't a stonking picture, I just burn it. I'm just looking at one of my paintings now. I'm just giggling a bit because I'm doing this catalogue and book and stuff, and you're going through stuff that you're lucky enough to have people write about the work at different times. I remember John McDonnell said, I'd forgotten this, and of course it's coming up again or something. Someone read me the quote. He said, he paints these paintings that look like they've been painted with a broom.
I think I read that.
And I think, some of them still look like they're painted with a broom. And he said, these beautiful, ugly, beautiful paintings, which I thought was the greatest compliment in a way at that stage, because I'm really interested in how apparent contradictory things somehow, they can be just contradictory, but they can also somehow envelop ideas and the truth of things, if you like, which are pretty interesting.
Yeah. So you mean contradictory as in it can be beautiful and ugly?
Yeah. Or that, I mean, a lot of the heroes in artists that I have had and still have are artists who have brought thing. I mean, Philip Guston's a good example. Okay, so Guston painted very beautiful abstract paintings, but partly because I think he was Jewish, partly because he was, surrounded by war and all sorts of things, and he was a sensitive dude. He realised that there was something lacking in those pictures that only could come from the world around, people and things and objects and stuff. And so he started to paint pictures which were very figurative. But what he'd done, I mean, I suppose this is a bit of a cliche, but what he'd done is, because he was interested in cartooning, and he had a couple of people when he was a kid that he loved, these strange black and white, drawings that cartoons are, or became anyway, he took on that role of taking something that Americans would have called lowbrow and taking it and making it highbrow. I mean, so they're nearly contradictory things, There are other American artists who've done something like it, but he did it in such a way. And it cost him his deal or his reputation for a while, and yet out of that has come some of the best American painting, as far as I'm concerned, of the 20th century.
Yeah. So. And I suppose that's all risk-taking as well.
Oh, it is. Of course it is. And without that risk-taking, I mean, I think it's one of the problems. I mean, thinking about it a lot, it's one of the problems that Australian art had. It's because you weren't confronted by the great pictures enough, to have to really reconcile yourself with, can I do that? Is it possible for me to do something with that sort of weight and presence? And if it is, how in the hell do you get to that? And it means you've got to look at a lot of great pictures, and you've got to, in a sense, be open to them and take the risk of you burning up on the way there. Risk-taking and trying, recognising that you got to keep pushing the boundaries is... I mean, Annie Dillard, the American nature writer, she talks about it in terms of writers. She talks about the writing life a bit like a tennis court. So you're playing... That's the rules. You've got to play within that thing. And if you're really good at it, you don't want to just win a point. You want to win a point by putting the ball on the very edge between out and in to win the point, the match and the game. That's what you want. Just to win a point. It's the edge. That's what you're after.
Yeah, right.
It's pretty tricky.
What do you mean?
Well, it's because you're trying to, in the thinking of the tennis court, if you like, you're really trying to extend the game, if you can call it a game, to the extreme of that the possibilities of what you're embarking on. So if you want to be a great writer, then you've got to do the hard yards. You've got to read a lot of stuff, and you've got to make a lot of mistakes, and you've got to keep making mistakes to learn from them. And if you think you've made it, then you're in deep manure.
So do you think that there should be a healthy amount of self-doubt?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, you can't have faith in yourself without doubt. There's the two apparent contradictions. Yeah, of course. Going back and standing in front of a great painting, that's why Frank Auerbach, bless his heart, still painting at 90-something or other, wanders down to the National Gallery to look at the Rembrandts. He's not wanting to try to paint like a Rembrandt. He just wants to see what really great art is, and am I up to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it sounds pompous and stuff, but in fact, really, I don't want stuff left that's half thought through when I'm dead. I mean, what's the point of it? I mean, you got to make a living, but It's much more than that. And great pictures, great poetry, great writing, they all talk to that. Great philosophy, theology, it's all, you know. I mean, I argued about this with different artists over the time, but, I mean, you know, in the end, it is the big questions. That's what matters. Well, there's one that's finished, that one there.
The second one.
Second one,
right?
Yeah, that's finished.
Fabulous.
I mean,
they're square. Well, what we're looking at is like sort of
they're
not
square,
all square. Oh, they are all square.
Square off square. Yeah,
that's interesting for a landscape.
Yeah, well, I early on I realised I didn't want them to be romantic landscapes. I knew that from the beginning, and so I basically painted on squares, and that stopped me having a long, you know, idea of this long landscape format thing.
Yeah, that's right. You don't often see square landscapes, I must say.
No.
And that must raise its own problems.
Oh, it does. I mean, yeah, it does. I mean, the centre of a square is a really difficult thing to deal with, and a lot of people don't go there because it's too damn difficult. But again, it's like the edge, the Annie Dillard thing. It's the problem is what may be the answer.
Do you ever feel like artists do talk about it, the painting taking over at a certain point and telling you what it needs?
Sure.
How do you get to that point, or how do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's it's hard to articulate that, but I mean, it's about all those things of intuition, luck, the creative process of taking risks. You know, there's no doubt about it that there are. I mean, if you're too cognizant of that happening, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah,
see, that's the problem again. I mean, and writers know this, and poets particularly. You know.
Do you feel like you've got to be sort of loose and receptive?
I think you've got to be open to the possibilities of disaster and ecstatic joy, or at the two ends, or the possibility of things happening which you never thought of, which you can claim as your own. But really, I mean, the only reason that you can boast about your pictures, really, is that you made something that was pretty good, and it was pretty good because the things happened which were accidental in some form or another, and all you did was acquiesce to them. You said, yes, that's right. It's shown me what is right, and I just have to say yes to it. Okay. I mean, and I mean that's not that easy to do, because, you know, everything else, all the arrows are coming in which says, is it any good? Will you get paid for it? Is this worth looking at? Why are you going out on a limb with this one? You don't need to go out on a limb. Oh, yes, you do. So there's a constant kind of anxiety at one level, a constant rethinking of what you are trying to do in one sense. And, you know, you've also got all these other great painters saying to you, not bad. Keep trying, you know, you might get there.
Yeah.
So yeah, and you know, as soon as you get into a sense where you think you're doing well, you're in deep trouble.
It's always interesting to hear artists about how they get their blacks. Well, how do you?
Well, I use quite a lot of metallic blacks now.
Oh, okay.
And so I mix them with ordinary blacks, and this Dutch company that I get my paints through, mostly through Parker's, they have some great blacks, some with actual material mixed in with it, and then I can mix them together, get other blacks and silver with, you know, standard kind of lamp black or whatever, whoever makes anything, you know. So, yeah, I mean, and then you mix, you know, warm blacks, cool blacks, flat blacks, glossy blacks, you know, metallic blacks, matte blacks.
Yeah. That was interesting because we were talking about earlier about your use of metallic paint.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about that and about how it started?
Yeah, well, basically, I mean, I mean, there's two little parts to it. One was that when I worked for my dad, he had a dry cleaning business. It had a boiler that kept everything going, okay? And all the pipes were steel and they rusted. So the only way you keep them from rusting up in the steam and everything in the boiler house was you had this stuff called silver frost, and you painted it on the pipes and anything that would rust, right? And I kind of liked it. I mean, I was at art school. Oh, this is interesting stuff, paint over everything, painted anything on the wall. And so I didn't really pay any more attention to that. But when I started to paint in the landscape seriously, particularly when I went to the outback, I started to see gold and silver and all this stuff reflected in the tree trunks and in the water. And I'm thinking, what are these English guys doing? What were they looking at? Well, they weren't looking at the same thing. That was the truth of it. And I just basically bought some silver paint and played around with that. But then I realised that, and I did this purposely for a while, I mixed silver paint used as my white. So I mixed my colours with silver. And so I got these crazy metallic other colours, which just weren't available. You couldn't buy it. And also, historically, there was no precedent. Matisse didn't have metallics. He didn't have acrylics. I mean, I had horrible stuff when I was at art school when acrylics weren't acrylics. They were PVA or something, and it was horrible stuff. The yellow was appalling. I never used yellow for years because of the crappy stuff that was. But once they started to make good acrylic paints that were safer and but they also did things which oil paint doesn't do. I mean, dries really quickly. You can do lots of glazing, all sorts of stuff.
Did you always use acrylics?
No, I learnt with oil paint initially, but I think trying to work out when I was at art school what Matisse was trying to do, I couldn't quite work out how he was using his oil paint. I mean, later on I learned it easily, but... it was basically the acrylics were versatile in a way that oil paint wasn't. And one of the nice things about them is that when I put stuff down, I haven't got very long to play with it. The beauty of oil paint in some sense is you can scrape it back, you can rework it, you can keep it going, it can go for days. Where once acrylic's dry, that's it. But in fact, that possibility of stumbling is actually a very useful kind of tool. What happens is that once you put it down, you either got to paint it over and start again, or something happens that's worth saving. So it's just you set up things eventually to keep you on your toes, so that you don't get used to making the same painting over and over again.
Well, that's interesting because with your plein air painting, I could imagine the use of acrylics must be really beneficial.
Well, it can be. I mean, when I first came back from England, what I did was, after painting bad Sid Nolans and bad other major artists, I realised that there was something I couldn't deal with in oil paint. And so basically what I did was started to do monoprints, right? And I used oil paint and printer's ink and stuff, and I made a box, which I still got somewhere, with perspex on it, and took rollers and ink and stuff, and I started to do monoprints in front of the landscape, if you like. And what it allowed me to do was work on thinnish paper. I could work on the front and the back. I could be absolutely ruthless, just saving only the things that were any good, and I could do a lot quickly. That allowed me to kind of start to see how thin, transparent kind of colour would work and what I was after. It just allowed me to try to find things that I did in my particular way. I mean, in some senses, you're it's a terrible term, really, style. Your approach is often governed by the kind of material that you're using. So if you're using really thick oil paint, then of course it has a viscosity, it has a sort of luster. There's certain lovely things about oil paint, and it takes forever to dry and all that sort of stuff. Okay, and that has often, for contemporary artists, meant building up quite extreme surfaces or thickness or whatever, which I didn't want to do because I couldn't draw easily over big lumps of oil paint or if it half dried and all that sort of stuff. I wanted to have a linear kind of drawing thing that was happening in the painting like Matisse.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he used very thin oil paint on fine canvas and could do that and had an assistant to wipe it off when it didn't work.
Oh, yeah, right. Is that what he did?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in fact, there's a couple of really great paintings that he did where, I mean, I think, again, Sperling talks about this and, he would come in and paint a chair and the window and maybe a figure on it, and then he'd realise that blue against that yellow looks bad, the wrong blue. And he'd say, well, it's still wet, it's oil paint. And he'd say to her, look, I'll be back tomorrow. Will you clean all that area off, right? And she would clean it off. In this case, she cleaned it off. And the stain of the blue and the stain of the yellow, which she cleaned off, the stain was a very different blue because the white had come through, very different blue than the blue that he'd used. And these two colours just sang together, right? So all he did then, outrageous, he did is just picked up some black, drew around the figure in the chair, put his name on it, and that was it.
Yeah, right.
And you can see that picture. And then he did a copy of that as a sort of a half-hearted joke in another picture on the wall. So, but yeah.
That leads me to the whole question of accidents and
sure.
like the unexpected.
Yep.
Is that something that you want to encourage in your work?
I think, it depends how you look at it, and it's been a debate I've had with myself for a long time and the people I read, I suppose, and it comes down to all sorts of things, philosophy, theology. But at one level, there's a kind of thing that happens, which is, if scientists would call it serendipity, right? And, they're chasing something down along A, B, C, D, for years, and they get nowhere. And they come back and think A, B, C, and then they see C actually led to Z. Mm-hmm. Something completely, and that's the answer, not this linear progress. And so, painting is kind of like that. Ken Whiston and I had a really good. Ken was a great painter and a great mind, and his understanding of painting, one of the things he was really strong about was intuition, the intuitive kind of response. And he used to, because he knew a lot of the earlier painters like Sid Nolan and people like that, and he used to say, well, when in doubt, just drop it down. You just do something, because eventually you can't intellectualise what's going to happen next. You just have to do something. And often that's a disaster, but out of the disasters comes possibilities,
Yeah,
Picasso said, some people seek, I find. Well, okay, he's being a smart ass, but he understood what it was to find something in the paint and in the painting that suggested or evoked what he was really after rather than what he thought he was after.
When you come to the studio, I'm always interested in what an artist's routine is and what they need to happen to get into the flow of painting.
Usually I have to not have to worry about whether I can pay that bill that I've just got for the paintings that I'm working on, or whether I'm going to live another 20 years. So do I need to get rid of all those things I've kept which are still bad and I really should dump? And what? Look, not all jokes aside, probably all of that, but I just want to have time to start to paint and see what happens.